Hello, thank you, Veronica. It is really my pleasure to be giving this lecture today as the student choice speaker. I appreciate the invitation and I really look forward to meeting with the grad students and learning more about the amazing work happening at UCSD. My talk for today is called Rethinking Toxicity Towards Building More Environmentally Just Worlds, and I'm coming to you from Toronto, which is on Lake Ontario on the Great Lakes, and is Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. And so I wanted to acknowledge that in addition. And my name is Michelle Murphy, as Veronica said, and I'm Métis from Winnipeg, and I've been living and working in Toronto for some 20 years. So I wanted to begin with thinking about the Great Lakes and what it means to give this talk and do research about chemical pollution and toxicity from the lower Great Lakes. The lower Great Lakes are the world's largest bodies of fresh surface water. They hold some 21% of the globe's fresh surface water. It's a very big honor and responsibility to live near these beautiful bodies of water that are particularly on the lower Great Lakes, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, surrounded by a history and dense legacy of industrialization, of fossil fuel capitalism, and of colonialism. And in thinking about what does it mean to do research and talk to you from the lower Great Lakes, I wanted to begin by naming this important treaty called the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. And this is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Confederacy. And kind of Haudenosaunee folks tend to have their nations and communities come to the south of the Great Lakes, also a bit to the north. And Anishinaabe is really kind of on the northern side and upward and westward. And this agreement predates colonialism, basically, and is an agreement between Indigenous peoples. The agreement doesn't look like a paper contract with a bunch of terms and you signed your signature, and then this kind of model where you make a contract, you sign your signature, the deal is done, and whatever the terms were on that paper is it. And we've all had this experience of doing our terms and services like on our iPhones, and we don't even read it, we like scroll through and click yes. Well, we can also think in a much more insidious way about the way those paper contracts worked during the 17th century as colonial instruments. Often the papers were blank and filled in later. The kind of meeting of two really incommensurate worlds in terms of how do you make agreements and contracts, all the kind of forms of theft and coercion that happen through the contract form. So this is another kind of treaty, and it's a treaty that works in a really different way, has a different mnemonic. It doesn't involve a piece of paper. Instead, it involves this beautiful wampum belt, which is made out of purple and yellow beads. So it's a binary mnemonic that are beads made out of quahog shells, or which are a kind of clam shell on the eastern seaboard. And the belt is quite big, and we can look at it and think about all the aspects that went into its making. So each bead had to be, the shells had to be brought over. Each shell makes a bead, so that's all hand done. And then you make the leather, you kill the animal and thank that animal, and you make the leather, and you tan it, and you go through that project with a group of people, and then you put the beads on, you discuss the kind of mnemonic and the design and what it's going to mean. And so there's incredible discussion and social relations that go into the making of a wampum belt. And we can see that the leather on the ends is not closed, but goes on. And that kind of signals that this agreement goes forward in time. It's meant to last. But in terms of taking care of this agreement, one has to return to caring for the belt, to discussing it, for polishing, right, the treaty over and over. And here the Dish with One Spoon covenant is a kind of treaty form that you can find around the Great Lakes, as well as the northeastern seaboard. And it's an agreement to live peacefully and in a shared territory together. And so if we kind of think about what it's like to be at a meal together, where there's one bowl and one spoon, and we're all going to be eating from this, how would we share it? How would we pass it on? What would it mean to not take more than your share and to make sure something's left for others? And how can we think about that relation of taking care of the bowl and kind of caring for the bowl and its contents when we're not just thinking about those around the table, but those yet to come. So kind of the temporal aspect. So this is the starting place for thinking about toxicity and chemical pollution on the lower Great Lakes for me. And here you can see Ogama is an indigenous art collective, and there's a billboard here that they did, which is here in downtown Toronto, where I live, that manifests the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. And it says in Anishinaabe if you start to learn something, you should start here. And so this treaty, this covenant, this, we could say, law that predates colonialism, that is the kind of law of this territory, is the starting place then for me to begin thinking with you about chemical pollution. So what I'm going to share with you today and think with you today comes out of collective collaborative work in an environmental data justice lab that I co-direct, that's at the Technoscience Research Unit at the University of Toronto. And this lab is a Indigenous led, Indigenous majority lab that involves both academics and community members. And you can see some of the important people here at the lab. You can see starting on the left, Vanessa Gray, who's an important land defender, and Anishinaabe and from Amjinong First Nation. Then next to her is Rena Shadan, who is comes to Toronto diasporically from Malaysia and previously worked on Bhopal and with Bhopal community organizations, and now works with our lab as well as nail salon workers around toxicity in the city. And then next to me is co-director of the TRU, Kristen Boss, is a professor at U of T and works on Indigenous feminist land-body relations. And so this is like kind of our core team. And so my work today really builds on this collaboration that we've been doing together since 2017. And the ideas and thoughts and approach I'm going to be sharing with you today for rethinking toxicity and chemical pollution builds on this really vibrant area, subfield in science and technology studies, Indigenous science and technology studies. When I was a graduate student, this field did not exist. And it's really with scholar, maybe exists in the last 10 years or so. So it's really scholars like Kim Tallbear, Marissa Duarte, and Elizabeth Hoover, and others, Chris Anderson, who've really led the way in Indigenous science and technology studies. And Indigenous science and technology studies tends to turn the tables on the way universities usually approach Indigenous people. And so rather than having like the university or science studies participate in the study of what Indigenous people are up to or what's happening to them. Indigenous science really is about Indigenous people bringing Indigenous values, Indigenous methods and practices to bear on the study of science and technology. And it's amazing too that in this world, there's actually a whole group of Métis people, which is, my community, that do science and technology studies. So we have folks like Zoe Todd, we have Max Liberon, Elizabeth Lepense, who does important game design and digital work, and Anne-Marie Consmo, who isn't quite a science-based person, but her work really influences all that we do at the lab. So the kind of big theoretical question I want to bring to you is, what if the objects academic disciplines teach us are in the world are wrong? So what happens if the kind of objects, the concepts that were given and gifted by fields like biology, like chemistry, like science and technology studies, like history, give us objects that are actually the kind of products and profoundly entangled in the violent relations we might be seeking to dismantle. Many of these disciplines were founded in the 18th and 19th century. They were founded in time of intensive colonial expansion. They're founded in relationship to, for example, in chemistry, capitalism, engineering, industrialism. So what happens? What do we do when our objects are wrong? They actually don't work for justice. They don't help us build the worlds we need to live in together. And so I invite you to think about that in your own work, but this is a core question for me in studying chemicals, chemical pollution and toxicity. What happens if these objects don't actually serve justice? They don't serve decolonial futures. What happens if they're wrong and we need to do something different? And then in asking this question, we can also say, well, what does it mean to say one wants to build more just worlds? The thing I want to highlight for you in this is worlds in the plural and the word just. So do we see justice as coming from the state, or do we take a decolonial approach and ask, where does justice come from if we want to say justice doesn't come from colonial institutions? And then worlds. Do we live in one world? We could say the world that believes in the one world, the world that believes in universal knowledge, the world, the kind of onto-epistemology of the West that tends to believe in that their knowledge and understandings and materializations of the world are the one world version of our existence. Or might we believe that there's many worlds and coexisting, sometimes incommensurate with one another? Here we can look in science and technology studies, we can look at the work of John Law, but we can also look at Indigenous scholars, we can look at the work of Marissa de la Cadena, we can look at Indigenous understandings that we live in a world of many worlds. What if there is more than one world? Can we build concepts? Can we work with concepts in a way that doesn't thicken the idea that we live in one world, but might support the world of many worlds in which we try to live together, following something like the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant as like where we might go to for justice. So here in thinking about this, I want to kind of honor that this framing comes from the Zapatistas. The world we want is a world in which many worlds fit. So can we build concepts? Can we work with science and technology to kind of materialize objects for a world in which many worlds fit? And to do that, I think we have to kind of follow some of the methods and kind of decolonial practices of scholars like Frantz Fanon, who was both an important decolonial theorist, but also was a practicing doctor and scientist and researcher, and is, I think, an important place for us to go to in science and technology studies for understanding our methods. And he describes the need to insert invention into existence. when we're confronted with these colonial and racist knowledge formations. So what does it mean then to insert invention into existence in a way that honors the world of many worlds? And I want to try to begin to reach towards that with you when it comes to thinking about toxicity, chemicals, and chemical pollution. So where to start? Where to start with this? Well, we know we've been told here in Toronto, we should start with the dish with one spoon, welcome covenant. Where we should start is then what would be called, and here I'm seeing a typo on my slide, but land-based land, not ODI, but body relations, land-based land, place-based land body relations. So in science and technology studies, we've been taught importantly, like through the work of scholars like Donna Haraway, to understand knowledge and materializations of objects as situated, right? We've learned about situated knowledge and situated materializations. And here I'm kind of offering up a slightly different approach, which is not to just situate, but to think about what's the kind of politics and approach to justice when it comes to technoscience that's place-based and that really begins with the specificities of land and land body relations. So what is toxicity? This is kind of my question. Here I'm going to be thinking about toxicity less in terms of like the ways of testing for it and more of in terms of the ways of like, what is chemical pollution? How do we approach it? So toxicity is typically posed as a problem of chemicals doing injury, chemicals doing harm. Here's a kind of picture of benzene. And when science manifests what a chemical is, they often do through models, through visualizations like this, like these structural diagrams that don't put many relations into what a chemical is. So we have like the physical structure between atoms, the forms of bonding. We might have physical properties like boiling point or volatility that then kind of manifest what a chemical is. And to my mind, this way of thinking about chemicals is incredibly impoverished. It doesn't discuss toxicity, injury. It doesn't tell us who made these chemicals. So this is naphthalene, something that's related to fossil fuel extraction and refining. It doesn't discuss like where these chemicals are, who made them, who might be responsible for them, who's connected to them, who has kinships with them, whose bodies they're in. It's really a model of chemical that is without a lot of relations. It's kind of purposely, I would say, removed many of its relations and reduced our understanding of like a chemical pollutant to it's basically just its molecular properties. So I think of this as chemicals in white space, where we have an incredible amount of unknowing and disconnection in our modeling of chemicals. And this way of thinking about chemicals and chemical pollution, I want to say doesn't work for justice. And it really, what it works for is molecular governance. And that's a term by Evan Hepler-Smith. It works for making IPs on chemicals. It works for, making databases and kind of libraries and logging kind of like what chemical properties are. It's useful for engineering and assembling new substances. It's useful for, kind of regulating chemicals one at a time rather than understanding a world in which kind of pollutants are all mixed up and happening coterminously. So it's designed for a particular need. And one of the most important places is not, there's a state, which is an important place for like doing this kind of chemical governance, but also, one of the most important places is the American Chemical Society, which is, basically an industry supported, industry kind of related body that logs each and every chemical, makes a kind of chemical abstract and say like, what's the properties of this chemical? It gives each a kind of number, and so they can be turned into IP. And this registry logs about 15,000 new chemicals a day. So in 2015, it hit 100 million. It's since passed 150 million. And this body is, incredibly influential for deciding like how we understand a chemical. And it was, founded, this way of thinking, in the late 19th century, very much towards kind of the ability to kind of regulate and control and facilitate the coal tar industry internationally. This form of understanding chemicals is also connected to what Kim Fortune calls the informating of environmental governance, and how since the 1980s in the United States and Canada, these two settler countries, really turned from regulating pollution to just like collecting data about pollution as like the way that, and chemicals as the way that you govern them. And so, this is another way for us to understand that our understanding of toxicity is very informated. So, what I'm trying to work against is the understanding of chemicals and toxicity like as something that really came out of a deep connection with colonial capitalism. It's a sense of the chemical as abstract and universal, is the same everywhere. It's part of that world of one world, that chemicals are the same everywhere. They're treated as small molecules, each individually, one at a time, with only really physical qualities to them. All the other aspects are removed from our understanding of what these chemicals are. Knowledges of how they affect bodies or particular lands, as well as who releases them, is kept apart from this understanding, this kind of system of chemical informating. And it really goes to support this detailed kind of form, which really ends up supporting like engineering, commodity production, and so on, and erases the fuller and longer relations that we might understand, what we might want to imbue into toxicity and chemical pollution. So the work that we do at the lab comes out of is about Ontario's Chemical Valley. This is about 3 hours away from Toronto. It's on the St. Clair River, which runs south from Lake Huron to Lake Erie and kind of turns into the Detroit River. So it kind of connects, on the one hand, Chemical Valley to the north, where 40% of Canada's oil is refined, and Detroit in the south, of the river, where the automobile industry in many ways was invented. So this is a corridor where a particular kind of fossil fuel capitalism came into existence over 150 years. It's also the home of the world's first commercial oil field. And so this area in Pennsylvania are the kind of two areas that kind of really invented this kind of fossil fuel capitalism. And if we think about that timeline, that's, Canada's about 150 years old. This is the timeline of Canadian colonialism. And Chemical Valley has about 57 or so facilities. And what I'm showing you now is a picture of the biggest and the oldest, which is the Imperial Oil Refinery. This is one we've done a lot of research on. It, we believe, is the oldest working refinery in the world. It goes back to about 1870 or 1871. And it's by far the biggest polluter in Chemical Valley. Chemical Valley is on the territory of Anishinaabe people, and particularly it's the territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, but also Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And Aamjiwnaang First Nation is kind of surrounded. You can see where it is on the map, the little green bit on the map where you can see all the dots of the facilities. Is surrounded by Chemical Valley, and much of that land some of it was expropriated via treaty, and other parts were stolen. And we can see on the other map that Aamjiwnaang's traditional territory went on both sides of this river. So one side's the US, one side's Canada. But Aamjiwnaang's traditional territory goes way from like Detroit past Chemical Valley to the east, to the west, and so on. And so on the one hand, we can understand Chemical Valley as a site that's been polluted for 150 years. And here we can see what kind of a early oil well looked like back in the day. More oil would spray up into the air and into the ground and into the water than would actually be captured in barrels. So you can think of there was like decades of that. And then above, you can see the kind of the early 1898 version of the Imperial Oil Refinery. But we can understand, yes, there's been this incredible legacy of pollution, there's also an incredible legacy at Amjad First Nation of land protection, of resisting, fighting, protecting the land against fossil fuel pollution. So it's really many, many generations of knowledge about what's happened to the land, as well as trying to protect and defend the land, as well as Indigenous sovereignty. And so in understanding pollution in the place-based site of Chemical Valley, we really understand this pollution as a form of colonialism. And here, you know, we've started to think this way in a project we did with Max Liboiron back in, I think it was 2016 or 2017. And really, you know, it's been in dialogue and learned a lot from Max Liboiron's work on pollution is colonialism. And here you can see, just to give you a sense, that Imperial Oil Refinery, which is some of the dots kind of near where it is to the right of, called the Dominion of Canada Refinery in its original instance, is to the side of other important kind of infrastructures of colonialism, such as the arrival of the railroad and the mission. And that's what these kind of these little dark squares are. So these things came together as part of the manifestation of the arrival of colonialism on this territory. And, you know, it's important in terms of understanding a decolonial approach to pollution to understand that disruptions to land are at the center of colonialism. So whether it's turning land into private property, whether it's land theft, expropriation, so on, this is at the center of how settler colonialism works. And pollution is an ongoing disruption to land and is an important form of ongoing colonialism. So here, this is an example of this ongoing disruption. This is a flare that occurred in February 2017 at the Imperial Oil Refinery, caught on a cell phone. Flare spills, accidents happen about every 2 or 3 days at Chemical Valley. Chemical Valley is very poorly regulated in terms of safety and pollution, even in comparison to the United States. Pollutants are about 50 times what would be in a comparable refinery in the US. There is very little risk management and safety management that's regulated by the government, and very little information sharing. So this, just to give you a sense of this, this is a flare that happened. It's like kind of, unlike a lot of pollution events, this one's easy to catch on a cell phone. And kind of like when you use a cell phone to capture police violence. This is a community capturing a moment of violence. This is the kind of information that the community of Amjanang would get, though, after such an event. Imperial Oil gives a kind of a release like this that says, oh, that was a grass fire. There are no issues with air quality detected, and there are no injuries. And so this is the kind of world of Chemical Valley. It's a gaslighting world. It's a world where the information is often bald-faced lies. And there's very little, usually more like a tweet or a sentence size information about an event like that. And when we think, so that's what the company's doing. The government, the federal government, has something called the National Pollution Release Inventory. It is like the TRI in the US. It requires each of the facilities in Canada that makes pollution up to that exceeds a certain level to report on some 300 chemicals. Those chemicals are on the list because there's an abundance of research about their harmfulness. And they're forced to report what their emissions are. So this data that these companies report is some of the only information we have about their emissions and pollution levels that tie pollution to these companies. And here you can see a chart that shows that most of the kinds of testing, so all the kinds of ways of reporting pollution that's in blue on this chart, is based on mathematical estimates. Only the ones in orange are actually physical measures. So we have this data about the emissions, but most of it is just like an estimate based on like an Excel spreadsheet. They're no actually facility or place-based measures taken. That's called indirect measures, and only something like 5.4% of all emissions have a physical measure. And this is not an accident. When this emissions release inventory was created, Imperial Oil and its oil owner company, which is ExxonMobil, fought to make sure that no measurements are taken beyond the most strictest limits of, or the measurements are taken are the most minimal that the law requires. So here's a memo we found in the archive that's from ExxonMobil down to the Imperial Oil refinery manager saying, there's absolutely no tolerance for effort of measuring pollution, extending beyond the minimal legal requirements. And so this lack of data and information about pollution is absolutely on purpose. And it's connected to a longer history of the way data works in settler colonialism and the ways that, whether it's surveys, property registries, or so on, data becomes a form of colonial extraction and colonial violence. It's wrapped up in that. And this is therefore, because the state facilitates this and allows this, is what we call permission to pollute, a permission to pollute state, and a kind of form of colonialism. And here Chemical Valley is so important to Canada that it used to be on its $10 bill. So the state is very much responsible for allowing companies to not monitor their pollution. So this gives you a sense of why I might call this chemical in white space, why the lack of information about toxicity and chemical pollution is part of settler colonialism. So let me then turn to maybe what an alternative understanding of chemicals might look like for a world of many worlds. So this alternative understanding would be based on place thought, not universal knowledge claims. It would be something that really highlights land-body relations, something that understands toxicity as infrastructural, not a property of an individual molecule. It would understand the relations that go into that materialize objects as responsibilities and not just ontological relations. And it would take a desire-based approach. So it's about building more just worlds. So just to say what place thought is, in using this term, I draw on the world of Vanessa Watt. So it's not just place-based, it's not just that it's local knowledge, but it's place thought. Place thought is the non-distinctive space where place and thought were never separated because they never could or can be separated. Place thought is based upon the premise that land is alive and thinking, and that humans and non-humans derive agency through the extensions of these thoughts. So it's a way of not just saying that knowledge is place-based, but kind of recognizing, particularly in Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, understanding that knowledge comes from the land, not from people. And then we are also manifestations of the land. And so when we understand like what is thought, thought comes from the land, right? And we're students of it. So the other side to I'm kind of putting place-based thought with desire-based approaches. And here I'm drawing on the work of Eve Tuck, an Aleut scholar, Indigenous feminist. What does it mean to do desire-based understandings of pollution rather than damage-based? So much when we try to understand pollution and toxicity, what we'd show is all the pathology, all the pain. We ask people to like expose their lives and their bodies and their suffering and their grief in order to show toxicity. Well, that can be very important, but what it often does is put the stigmatize already stigmatized communities and put the burden of representing violence and harm on the people being harmed. And so in the desire approach says, well, what does it mean to insert invention into existence that's not just about explicating and revealing harm, but saying, no, we want to have and put invention into existence using place-based thought towards the desire to live, let's say, in relation to the one dish and one spoon wampum covenant, to manifest decolonial futures, to manifest more feminist futures, to manifest indigenous, let's say Black solidarities on the lower Great Lakes around pollution, living in our world of many worlds. So that's the desire. It's a positive desire, thinking about what we want to be doing with our work. When I say land-body relations, I'm drawing on particular Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee understandings of what land is. Land is not just soil, it's not just territory, it's like all our relations, it's all the aspects that are in a territory, against its waters, its airs, the organisms, the beings, the flows. It's the ancestors and the past beings that are now kind of in the soils, and then it's like the futures. The future is also in the land. You know, in this understanding, kind of reproduction isn't just something that happens like in a species or between bodies. Reproduction passes through the land and into our bodies. We are land beings. And so understanding these relations is nested. So we're not just like object organisms in a ecological relation, we're land beings in all our relations of land. And in a place like Chemical Valley, or any place on the Great Lakes, or maybe like most places in Canada or United States, you know, land has been disrupted. Land is a site of violence. It's been disrupted by colonialism, it's been disrupted by capitalism, it's been disrupted by racism, by pollution. And this violence then is not just on the land, it's violence on lands and bodies together. So, you know, the oil refinery, the pipeline, all of that is not just on the land and doing things to the land and then like affecting our bodies, but it's in our bodies. If we're land beings, we become in these complicated relations, which we could say with the kind of bad kin of fossil fuel capitalism. And here in Chemical Valley, this fossil fuel capitalism, and taking the starting point as the Imperial Oil Refinery, is not just local, right? It's Imperial Oil was bought early in the, or late in the 19th century by Standard Oil, which we know became ExxonMobil, is like the biggest oil company in the world. It's a multinational. Chemical Valley is connected. It's a site of the meeting point of pipelines. There's actually hundreds of pipelines in Chemical Valley running between facilities, as well as extending continentally. It's an important place where the oil sands of Alberta, the oil from the Back and Shield, come to be refined. It's a site of international shipping that goes through the Great Lakes and out to the Atlantic Ocean. There's the railroad here. There's the meeting of the trucking and all the highways. This is a huge infrastructure. So when we say, what is pollution? What is toxicity? Does it stop with the molecule, or does it go out to these kinds of infrastructures? So you have to think place-based, but also that the place-based is disrupted and interconnected by these often multinational, transnational infrastructures of colonialism and capitalism. But here's an example of some of the pipelines that meet here. And, you know, I can't help but always notice that like the pipelines, the transit stations, the companies always like pick indigenous names to name them, which is like kind of just an extra slap. So in Canada, we only have 17 refineries, and I think in the United States, there's like 127, but our 17 refineries up here create more pollution than all the refineries together, than all the refineries in the United States. So just to give you a sense of how unregulated it is. And this infrastructure doesn't just end with the pipelines and the railroads. This is a kind of little chart that might give you that tries to give you a sense of like how to think about, yes, there's all the transport, the trains, the etc. There's the gas stations, there's the cars, there's the facilities, but then there's all the finance capital, right? That owns those objects or those infrastructures, that manages them through stockholder relations. And then those goes into your pension funds, your mutual funds, the union funds, and so on. And so pensions, universities, mutual funds, investment firms, basically global financial capital and its manifestations in maybe your life are also part of this infrastructure of what toxicity is. So here we can look at something like the work of the Indigenous Environmental Network and their work trying to trace these finance capital relations. There's 33 basically banks that they've kind of keyed into as key banks for manifesting this infrastructure. And 4 of the top banks are headquartered in the United States. If we look at the owners of Imperial Oil, ExxonMobil's like the biggest oil owner with 68%, and all the kind of most of the rest are hedge funds, investment funds, and so on. If we look at who then owns ExxonMobil, and there's a spelling mistake there, in turn, ExxonMobil is also owned by investment funds. So finance capital is part of this infrastructure, and that's another, can we trace our understanding of toxicity out to this? And then getting back to kind of place thought and a place-based understanding of toxicity and a desire-based approach, then how do we understand then Chemical Valley as not just like the place where this violence is like meeting and intensifying, but that the land behind the fence is still sacred, that this disrupted land and our land-body relations in sites of violence, our lives manifested and kind of made in part through violence, are also still sacred, and we can still have a desire-based approach towards them. So this is my kind of chart, instead of like the chemical and white space, of how chemicals work, and maybe in the Q&A we can come back to it, and I can talk more about it, some of the ways that I'm thinking about it as a kind of a manifold set of extensive relations. But for now, I want to show you this painting by Ken Monkman and say, how if we imagine this as opposed to that structure of the chemical as a picture of what toxicity is, right? So we have the state manifesting here to like protect the company. We have the plumes of cumulative chemical relations that are disrupting land. And then we have land defenders. We have indigenous people manifesting indigenous sovereignty, manifesting another legal oil, trying to defend the land behind the fence, and that towards the horizon of a desire, and for a decolonial future, and for the desire for ongoing indigenous thriving and sovereignty. And so this is also a diagram or a visualization of what toxicity is. In 2019, the other refinery that is the same age as Imperial Oil, which was in Philadelphia, exploded. It also dated to 1870. They were kind of like the twins, and is now closed. And so, on the one hand, we can see like the incredible risks these refineries are to land, to Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and so on. And at the same time, another way to look at this is like, even these old refineries don't want to exist. They're like looking to die. And here in Chemical Valley, the Imperial Oil Refinery, many parts are very old. There was a tower that just fell in the summer, just like fell over. We look at the refinery, the steel that made it, even the oil that came from that ground. That oil is not in and of itself a violence. It's part of land. This steel is not in and of itself a violence. It's part of land. And even it can be pulled towards better relations, good relations, desire-based futures. So if we want to then imbue a sense of toxicity with a kind of alter ontology, or a place-based, thought manifestation on the Great Lakes for a world of many worlds, one place to start is just no pipelines on Indigenous land. Another place to start would be like divestment from banks that fund this infrastructure. That's another way to think about how do we take care of toxicity rather than just its immediate monitoring. And if we look at in the kind of larger picture of Canada, the orange are the open refineries, and the blue and the purple are all the closed refineries. And there's way more closed refineries than there are open refineries. And so this vision, when you're in Chemical Valley, like this place can never change, is altered if you think, well, this place has only been here for 150 years, and Anishinaabe people have been here for thousands. And hey, most of the refineries are already closed. And fossil fuel capitalism will not be here forever. And so I just want to end on this kind of desire-based note. Even from these toxic spaces, we will grow strong and beautiful. This is the title of this artwork by Dylan Miner, who lives actually on the other side of the river over in Flint, and who's the chair of Indigenous Studies there. And this idea that, you know, we're not going to like end colonialism and end white supremacy and end racism and patriarchy and, you know, fossil fuel, defiance of fossil fuel capitalism with a STS paper, but can we do work that is in this direction of desire and harm reduction now? Like, even if it's an impossible task, I do think the responsibility of our kind of, we can call it like ontological work in STS, still in the here and now does not have to defer and can commit to this ongoing desire-based harm reduction way of working. So I want to say miigwech, merci, thank you. Acknowledge some of the funders of our lab and the work we do, and acknowledge the many, many people who I'm learning from as I do this ongoing work, and to thank you for your attention and to look forward to your questions. Thank you.